The Samsung Galaxy S10 and S10 Plus were released the March of 2019, along with an all-new Galaxy S10e that was smaller and more budget-oriented, not dissimilar to the iPhone XR or 11. The phones were received extremely well, being Samsung's first to have the hole-punch notch, with very little bezel around the phone, along with those classic seamless curved edges. It was a gorgeous device, and it's hard to believe it's already 4 years old. That front could be a 2023 smartphone. The back, on the other hand, maybe more like a 2017 smartphone. After this, and maybe the Note 10 as well, camera bumps would just get bigger, and yet even bigger. So it definitely feels a little aged back there, but from the front, where you actually look at, things definitely feel pretty current, even if it's a bit behind in Android updates. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and I would consider the S10 to be the start of the current era in Samsung smartphones. All in all, this phone was hugely popular for good reason, and it's still used by many out there today. So we asked the question, how does the Galaxy S10 hold up? And could it even still be worth buying? As always, timestamps will be in the description below, and we'll start with the differing models and the state of the S10 4 years later. I just barely bought this a year ago for $300 Canadian. It's not going to cost you quite that much anymore, but yeah, I was a little late to this review. I didn't get the S10 Plus, but you're not missing out too much going for the smaller model, and this review should apply to both. The S10 is 6.1 inches versus 6.4 on the S10 Plus, and with that bigger model, you'll be getting a decent battery life increase. Size really is the main factor between the phones, but the easy way to differentiate the two is the dual selfie cameras on the Galaxy S10 Plus. It includes an extra 8 megapixel depth sensor to add bokeh in selfies. The back cameras are the exact same on the two phones, making the decision again really come down to size more than anything else, and possibly price. So you've got the S10, the S10 Plus, and then the S10e, a more budget-oriented phone that loses out on the under-display fingerprint reader and instead puts it on the power button. Personally, I would actually prefer that. Under-display fingerprint sensors can be very hit and miss, and the S10 was one of the earlier phones to do it, so it's really no exception. It's okay, it performs for the most part just fine, but I would imagine it on the power button would be a bit more reliable. It has dual cameras instead of the triple setup, a smaller 5.8-inch full HD display, 6 gigs of RAM instead of 8, and then some other minor variations, but that's the gist. And so those are the three main Galaxy S10s, but there are actually a couple more, which is pretty typical, as Samsung has always seemed to love making their phone lineup as convoluted as possible. The Galaxy S10 Lite is simple enough and came out in 2020, being an even more budget-oriented option, and then the Galaxy S10 5G was even bigger than the Plus at 6.7 inches, and of course came with 5G networking. Ultimately though, most looking at an S10 will be interested in one of the three main models that all came out 3 years ago and are no longer supported by software updates. Occasional security updates will still hit though, so at least there's that. And while this is Android 12 instead of 13, the experience doesn't feel drastically different. It still feels kind of like a high-end phone. It still runs pretty spiffy, which is great to see, and that's always a concern when it comes to these newer updates. Unfortunately, with no Android 13, this is what you have, and this is what you'll get. Android 12 and Samsung's own skin, One UI 4. Don't expect anything ever coming in terms of features. Some security updates here and there, but that's about it. We're not getting into custom ROM stuff in this video. That's always something you can look into on your own, though with Android, not being on the latest version isn't the end of the world, so you miss out on new features and might start to experience incompatibilities over time, so it comes down to your own personal preferences and tolerance for out-of-date software. So you're losing out on some modern luxuries, including some newer features like 120 Hz, but that might be worth it when you take the price point into account. Going to eBay.com and just looking up the Galaxy S10, I was immediately met with the 10e for like $100, which is kind of insane. However, I would definitely go up to at least the S10 because it's barely more, and you're getting a more premium phone with a larger, better display. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a more premium-feeling smartphone for that $150 price point. Also, yes, I've said the word premium a whole lot in this video, but it's just kind of the best word to describe this phone. Plus, this phone has a headphone jack. Did I mention that? It has a headphone jack. While generally I don't recommend buying used phones, as it can be a bit of a roulette spin when it comes to eBay or wherever you end up getting it from, older Samsungs tend to hold up pretty well in hardware, just not so much in software, and so it comes again down to your own personal preferences. What do you want from a phone? Ultimately, there's no questioning that for $150, maybe $200, this is one heck of a piece of hardware. But these being using older phones, you are going to have downsides, like battery life. It depends on how much the phone has been used over the years, but it's a safe assumption, unless it's a fairly new battery, you might find some struggling with heavy use. That's something to always be a little bit wary of when it comes to these older phones, especially because with Samsungs, you can't just swap out the battery like you used to be able to. There's also unfortunately no micro SD card slot, so whatever storage capacity you buy, you're stuck with. But we do get the new-ish features on pretty much every phone nowadays, like wireless charging, water resistance, fast charging, and always on display, and so on and so forth. The speakers aren't great, but with a headphone jack, I certainly am not going to complain, because that's a pretty good alternative. The specs of the S10 can vary a little bit when it comes to both the chipset as well as the amount of RAM. In the US, you're going to see the Snapdragon 855 processor, whereas elsewhere you may see the Exynos 9820. There's always little differences between them, and it can make a big difference when it comes to custom ROMs and things like that. RAM can vary from 6 to 8 gigabytes. Performance seems to be fine. It's not going to set the world on fire because it's not the Note 7, but it's fast enough for the basics, no problem, and pretty much any app or pretty much anything you could do on here, you shouldn't have too much trouble. There is a bit of that classic Samsung lag. It's just a little bit of slowdown here and there, but this is nitpicking. This is a very premium feeling phone. So with all that, let's go ahead and move over to the camera system. The selfie cam is 10 megapixels. Honestly, it's pretty good. I wouldn't ask for much more than this. And again, you do get a second sensor on specifically the S10 Plus and the S10 5G. The back camera system is the same across all phones except for the S10e, which only has 2 camera lenses. It misses out on the telephoto. The wide lens is 12 megapixels, the ultra wide is 16 megapixels, and then the telephoto lens on the better models is also 12 megapixels and offers 2 times optical zoom. This makes for some great versatility when needing to take a photo of something slightly further away or something too close. You get the idea. It's just nice to have. The photos were surprisingly kind of bad, at least not great. Some of them were okay, some of them were actually half decent, and some were just awful. I genuinely thought I was getting a good shot here, but it's completely out of focus. And this was a commonality among quite a few photos. It was very sunny, but these flowers, I do not know what the camera was doing here. The colors all blend together and it's just a bit of a mess. I can tell this camera is good. Like, it's good enough to take a decent shot. You just need to take your time with it, steady your aim, and don't just snap, snap, snap like I did. I think it would also be better if you went and downloaded the Google Pixel Camera APK and kind of went to that extent, but overall here, yeah, just not the best camera experience. It is a 4-year-old smartphone. If smartphone photography is important to you, I would definitely be looking for something better. It can record video in 4K 60, this is 4K 30, and this is fairly standard. If we move to low light situations, that's where things really start to struggle, and it already wasn't terrific. This is just kind of a mediocre camera. There's no other way to put it. It is older, but still a bit disappointing. I think it's good enough for someone who already had this phone. Like, I wouldn't be absolutely desperate to upgrade, so overall, I don't have a huge issue with it, especially if you're spending around that $150 mark. You can only expect so much for that price point. And that kind of just sums up my experience with the phone in general. I haven't really had too many issues. While the software is a bit behind, the hardware itself is just classic premium Samsung. It doesn't feel like a 4-year-old phone, in large part because Samsung always builds these things so well. It feels good in the hand, it looks so premium with that infinity display, it actually has a headphone jack, and if you can find this for under $200, I think you're getting a pretty darn solid deal on what is still a pretty high-end experience. And if you have it right now, while I do think it would be worth upgrading to get a better camera system, if that isn't your main concern, I think most will be okay with waiting just a little bit longer, assuming battery life is lasting you okay, because again, that is a concern with all used phones. It's not unique to this one. So with that being said, I think we're right about done here. Not a ton to say because again, the phone does hold up quite well, assuming you're okay with the slightly older cameras and the slightly older software. It's been fun to look at the S10 finally, and I'll hopefully be looking at the S9 pretty soon as well to see how that holds up 5 years later now. So if you enjoyed the video or found it helpful, maybe hit that like button and consider subscribing for more content just like this. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.